Let's kick off this series by talking about the difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing. A lot of people ask me which path they should choose when they're first deciding how to get published. And the answer that I always give is, it depends. It depends on a lot of different things about what your goals are as an author. So the first step when you're trying to figure out whether or not you should go traditional or indie is to figure out what your goals are as an author. Think about the next 6 months, think about the next year, and think about the next 5 years. And make your decision based off of what you actually want as an author. I'll give you a bit of a breakdown so that it's a little easier to make that decision. First, we'll talk about traditional publishing, which is probably the most well-known version of publishing. It's been around since as long as publishers have existed. In traditional publishing, you are using a publisher who is usually based in New York City, but not always, to distribute your book. But these publishers are so well established that they don't just accept any manuscript. In order to get your book considered by a big publisher in New York, you have to have a literary agent who can go on submission for you. And going on submission is basically the process of having an agent send your book to editors at the various imprints in New York City. I'll do another video breaking down how publishing works in New York City, but the basic thing you need to know is that there's an umbrella publisher and a bunch of little imprints inside that publisher. So when people talk about the big 5 publishers in New York, they're talking about the distributor, and then they submit to individual imprints based on their genre and interest. So for example, if you're writing a young adult novel, your agent is not going to submit that to an imprint that only does nonfiction books. And there are different editors that work at these different imprints, and then they all get published through their parent umbrella distributor, of which there are 5 major ones, and they're based in New York City. The reason this is the most well-known version of publishing is because this is the one that gets your book into all of the different bookstores and libraries around the country. And I'll offer a caveat here because not everybody has the same publishing experience, even if you're with the big 5 publisher, even if you're with the same imprint. Because it all boils down in traditional publishing to how well they think your book will sell. So if they think your book is going to sell incredibly well, they will pay you a really big advance and they will put a lot of money into marketing your book. Basically, if they think the book will sell, they will distribute as many places as they can. And if they're not super convinced the book will sell, or if you're a marginalized author and just facing a lot more challenges in that regard, they may not distribute your book as far. So it's important to emphasize that even though people think traditional publishing will get you into bookstores, that is not a guarantee. There are imprints out there that are with the big 5, but predominantly put out ebooks or audiobooks. So always do your research on the imprint that your agent is going to be submitting to, because this is the agent's job, but it's also the author's job to keep tabs on what's going to be published. The process of getting a literary agent is called querying. Querying is the process of sending a query letter to a literary agent that summarizes your book and basically mentions why they should want to represent it. Since agents get dozens to hundreds of books a week, they don't have time to go through and read every first chapter that they get in their inbox. So a query letter is basically like a 3-paragraph summary of your book that tells them why they should be interested and how it's going to sell. There is a very specific format that a query letter is supposed to be in, although in recent years there have been online forms filled out through Query Manager, which is a website that most agents sign up for and basically subscribe to. So instead of sending an email or a letter with an actual query letter in it, you would basically just fill out the different boxes in this form, and that's like your query letter. Querying is very, very hard and takes a very long time. So that brings us to the first point that people need to consider if they're deciding to go with traditional publishing. How many book ideas do you have? How fast do you write? And how long are you willing to wait? I started querying back in 2015, and it took me 3 years to get a literary agent. I queried 3 novels and amassed over 350 rejections between those novels. I didn't even get a request from one of those agents until the 3rd book I queried, because that was the moment that I learned how to structure a query letter and how to make my first chapter attractive to agents. All of that is a really long learning curve, and because the competition is so fierce in getting represented by a literary agent, you're up against a lot of really good other books. So even if your book is not getting anywhere in the querying trenches, it's important to remember that it's not necessarily a reflection on your writing, it's potentially just a reflection on what that agent is looking for at that moment in time. Long story short, if you have several years to wait and you don't write very fast, traditional publishing is a really good option for you. Another thing to consider when you're thinking about traditional publishing is how much time you have to market your book. Traditional publishing is a benefit because once you get picked up by a publisher, even though that process can take years, you end up with a really great team of people behind you who know how to sell books. So if you're maybe not so good at social media, it can really be a benefit to have a publisher behind you who's putting actual money into marketing your book. And I'll deviate here for a moment by saying that publishers do not require social media presence. If your book is good, they'll pick it up no matter what. You do not need to be on social media to sell that book. Does it help to have a platform? Absolutely. But if that is something that will absolutely make you miserable, don't do it. It's just not worth the time. To summarize, traditional publishing is slow as fuck. It may take you several years to get a literary agent to represent you, and it may take you several more to sell a book to a publisher. Just because you get a literary agent does not mean that a publisher will buy your book. But if you can get through the gates, you can have the potential to have a really great team of professionals at your side promoting your book. And the distribution that traditional publishing brings, the ability to put your book in bookstores and libraries, is something that no indie author can really compare to. So it really just kind of depends on what you want out of your book at that time. Let's talk about indie publishing now. I'll offer a caveat here for indie publishing. There's a bit of a debate going on about whether or not self-publishing is indie publishing is self-publishing. And I kind of ignore all of it because I think that it's basically interchangeable between the two terms. But sometimes when people talk about self-publishing, they're talking about an individual uploading their book to a place like Amazon. And when they're talking about indie publishing, they're talking about an author selling a book to a small press or an indie press. I have opinions on those. We'll talk about small presses later. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to go over self-publishing or indie publishing as the individual publishing their book to Amazon and other distributors. So why would you want to choose this option instead? The basic answer here is freedom. You can control everything when you go into self-publishing. At no point do you have to go to anybody else and ask them for permission to do literally anything. So you get to decide what your cover design looks like, and you get to decide how the interior is formatted, and you get to decide when the book is done and edited, and you get to decide where you want to sell it. And you get higher royalty rates for those things because you own the rights to that book. So when you are selling traditional to a publisher, you are not selling the intellectual property for that book. You are selling the right for the publisher to publish that book in a certain format. And when you're doing self-publishing, all you're doing is basically handing Amazon the right to self-publish that book for you. But the royalty rates are significantly higher on the back end because you still own those rights. And if you take that book off of Amazon at any time, they do not continue to have the rights to self-publish that book. However, that freedom does come with a bit of a downside because all of those things that I just mentioned cost money. When you are self-publishing, you have to do something like buy your ISBNs, which can be up to $250 for 10 of them in the US. And that might sound like a lot, but keep in mind that you need one ISBN for every version of your novel. So if you have a paperback, an audiobook, a hardcover, and an ebook, you need 4 ISBNs for that book. Then you end up getting into editing costs or copy editing costs, which are quite expensive. The rates are different depending on the year and obviously depending on inflation. So I won't mention any numbers here in case this video is like 5 years old by the time you get to it. But the Editorial Freelancers Association usually has a breakdown of current industry rates. So you can just go onto their website, the Editorial Freelance Association, and find those rates there. Then after you get your book edited and you're ready to go and you have your ISBNs, you still need to get a cover together and you need to format the book so that it looks like the interior of an actual published novel. There are formatting softwares that you can get, we'll go into those later, but they all cost money. And a cover design costs a lot of money because you need to buy commercial rights for that image and then potentially get a typographer to go and overlay the letters on top of the cover. So like the treason without tea over top of the image of the treason, if that makes sense. Long story short, when I self-published Can't Spell Treason Without Tea in 2022, I spent about $2,100. And that was not too expensive for most people because I didn't actually use an editor. I was lucky enough to have worked with editors in the past and I was able to go ahead and save that money by self-editing. But I do not recommend this for people who have not written a lot of books and dealt with a lot of professional editors in the past. Treason was my 15th book for comparison. So cost is the big detractor for indie publishing. Now I will say a benefit on the back end in regards to cost is that indie publishing pays out significantly faster than trad, like leagues and bounds faster. So if you publish a book on Amazon, you will wait 60 to 90 days depending on what kind of distribution level you do and when you publish. But no more than 3 months later, the payment for that book's release will be in your bank account. In contrast, most traditional publishers pay advances to their author. And these advances are basically a predetermined rate that says that they think that book will sell X amount of dollars over the course of its lifetime. So they hand you that money up front and they take a little bit of a risk on the back end. And it also means that you don't get any royalties until you, as the traditional author, pay back that advance. Now, if your book does not sell, you do not have to pay back that advance. There is really only one clause that would require you to actually pay back a book advance, and it's if you completely fuck up on social media and get canceled or they can't publish your book for some reason. Literally in every other publishing scenario, you are not required to pay back your advance, but if you don't earn out the advance, you could be blacklisted in the industry later. So you really want to earn out your advance if possible, because then you start getting royalties on the back end in traditional publishing. But publishers don't want to just hand you $100,000 in one lump sum. Instead, they end up breaking down that lump sum into multiple payout options. For example, one payout could be for the signing of the contract, another payout could be for the submission of the manuscript and acceptance of it, another payout could be for the actual publication of the manuscript, and now they're starting to pull out the advance even further by saying 1 year after the publication date, you'll get your final payment. So suddenly that $100,000 payment is broken down into $25,000 each, and it doesn't seem so big, especially when you spread it out over several years, because that's how long it takes traditional publishing to get a book out. Compare that with the 90 days that it takes to get paid out when you're self-publishing, and that's a lot more attractive option for many people. I know when I decided to self-publish, the big reason for it was because I really wanted some extra help on my rent. And I was hoping that Treason would make me just a couple $1,000s, maybe over a course of several months that would help me pitch in for rent. Now, Treason did much better than that, and that is because of one thing and one thing only. And that was my social media presence. I got on TikTok and I started talking about my book while I was writing it. So by the time I went to the publication process of getting this book out there, most people on TikTok already knew it was coming. And in the meantime, I'd started making friendships with these other authors and promoting their books when I could, which meant that by the time my book was ready to come out, I had a lot of really good author friends who were willing to host that book on their platforms and get it out to more people. This book was a success because people on TikTok found it. And that is where social media can come in handy for self-published authors. Again, it's not required that you get on TikTok or any social media platform. But if you're going to be self-published, you have to remember that any day you don't promote your book is a day that no one finds your book because there is no publisher helping you distribute it. So that's, again, that pros and cons. You just have to gauge what your goals are and what you're willing to do in the short term and the long term to meet them. To summarize, I think that there are specific kinds of authors that can succeed in each version of the publishing process. If you are looking to go traditional, you are probably an author who writes a little slower because traditional publishing is very slow, and you probably want a team behind you to help you promote that book. You might not be great at social media, or maybe you are, but you're still not really interested in keeping social media as your long-term presence. You also probably love having a literary agent behind you who can help you edit your manuscripts, negotiate your contracts, and keep an eye out for future opportunities. A business partner, right? You're not doing it alone. And that, I think, is the big thing for traditional publishing. You don't want to do it alone. You might be interested in the clout on the back end, you might be interested in more money on the back end, but that's not a guarantee with traditional or with indie publishing. So basically, if you're going traditional, it's not about the money and it's not about the clout, it's about whether or not you want a team of people behind you and how long you're willing to wait to get it. In contrast, when you're looking at self-publishing, you are probably a person who writes very quickly. So you might be putting out multiple manuscripts a year because you're able to do that rapid release schedule where you're dropping 2 to 3 books a year. Potentially up to 5. I know authors that will drop 5 books a year. This is, again, not a requirement with indie, but it does help to keep the hype around your book. If you have a lot of content coming out, your name is going to be on a lot of people's tongues all the time, which makes your job easier as a marketer. You probably are also very interested in keeping a social media platform or engaging with your readers on a very personal level. Your networking skills are ideally top tier because booksellers and librarians won't know to stock your book if you don't meet them and tell them about it. There's no publisher to do that for you if you are going to be indie publishing. But you also are interested in getting paid significantly faster than you would be if you went traditional, which can be great too. This is a very long-winded way to say that it's up to you. If anyone tries to tell you that one path is better than the other, they're full of shit. There is no right or wrong way to publish your book. It all just depends on your own personal preference and what you want out of your novel on the back end. And the nice thing is that if you start traditional and you decide that you really don't like querying, you can always take that book and self-publish it later. Or if you're like me and your indie book does really, really well, you might start getting publisher interest and decide to go traditional on the back end. That's literally what happened for Can't Spell Treason Without Tea. I self-published it and then I got Big 5 interest in New York, and then I decided to sell the series to a publisher in New York. So don't be afraid to pick one path or another and then think that you're locked in, because you can always adjust your strategy as needed. I had a literary agent for years and I left her after 4 years to self-publish. Some literary agents don't care if you do both. Those are called hybrid authors, by the way, and that's technically how I identify. So think hard about what your short-term and long-term goals are when you are looking into your publishing paths. Neither option is bad or good. It's just personal preference. I hope that helped, and stay tuned for another video.